system in Florida. The hospitals took a tremendous hit. We've been assisting the state and local governments to evacuate patients, get them stabilized. It's my understanding that we've also set up what are called decompression units, over 3 right now. These are basically triage centers to backfill medical support where we've lost the capability of some of the hospitals, and we'll continue to work and stabilize those areas. Obviously, we're doing damage assessments and moving DSA, our disaster assistance support team, in to start registering people. But the other focus is on communications. You have to be able to communicate to appropriately respond, and you know, we're trying to do everything we can to get the private sector vendors, the Verizons and AT&Ts of the world, to get in to try to get their systems back up and running, so that not only you know, so that citizens can begin to communicate on a normal routine, but that's going to take some time because the infrastructure was damaged. It's still not safe to return, particularly to Bay County, Florida. Doing so, there's no infrastructure there to support you. And quite honestly, it's a dangerous area to go back into. You know, when you have this type of destruction, there's gas lines that are there, there's power lines that are down. In doing so, you're putting your life in danger, and we ask you to be patient, you know, before you just try to rush back into those areas, and understand that we're doing everything that we can to get the roadways open and trying to stabilize the situation so that people can go home and figure out how to put the rest of their livelihood back together, you know, down there in Bay County and some of those areas. Again, with the transportation lifeline, we're doing work across all of these lifelines, 7 lifelines. You know, we're actively supporting safety, security, health and medical, food, water, and shelter. Obviously, power is the most important part. We have over 30,000 people in the private industry that are trying to get the power grid back up and running. But as we said yesterday, the infrastructure took a tremendous hit, particularly where you saw storm surge and 155-mile-an-hour winds encroach, and then it moved inland in southwest Georgia. Communications, transportation, and hazardous materials. That's where we're focused right now, and that's what these folks up here represent, and how the federal government is coming together to support our governors and the local governors. I have specifically spoken with Governor Deal this morning in Georgia, as well as Governor Scott in Florida. I'm also anxious. I will be getting downrange tomorrow night and be on the ground Sunday and Monday as well, to make sure that we're also doing everything that we can down there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken Wedeleski with our partners from NOAA to talk about impacts.
And good morning, everyone. Good news from the weather aspect of things. Michael will be moving rapidly out to sea today. Just a few more hours of heavy impacts along southern New England. High surf, heavy rainfall, strong winds. Fortunately, that'll be shoved well out to sea by tonight. We will see, though, the threat for river flooding continuing in Virginia, down toward the North Carolina, Piedmont, even toward coastal areas well into next week as runoff trickles down toward the south. However, we don't see any significant weather patterns moving into the area over the next week, so the river should recede at least by the middle to latter half of next week. So no significant weather threats beyond this. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Next is Health and Human Services, Dr. Kevin Yeske.
Good morning. We continue to work with state authorities, state health authorities, and private sector partners from hospitals and other healthcare facilities, and we stand by ready to support whatever needs they may have as they respond to the hurricane response. Yesterday afternoon, Secretary Azar declared a public health emergency in Georgia. Like the one earlier this week declared in Florida, this declaration gives the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services beneficiaries and their healthcare providers and suppliers greater flexibility in meeting the emergency health needs. We still remain concerned about the health of the people impacted by the storm, and we continue to assess and assist with healthcare needs in Florida. In Florida, the state officials and private sector partners reported significant damage to the healthcare system. Right now, 4 hospitals are closed and 11 nursing homes are closed. The healthcare system in Georgia fared better as all hospitals are open. We set up medical bases of operation in Panama City and the 2 largest hospitals. Those hospitals are evacuating but keeping their emergency services open. The hospitals are using their own resources and state resources to evacuate patients. Our disaster medical assistance teams are working alongside emergency department staff at Bay Medical Sacred Heart Hospital and Gulf Coast Regional Medical Center to care for people coming into the emergency department. Our medical personnel are also working with FEMA's urban search and rescue teams to triage people rescued by those teams. Under a FEMA contract, ambulances are available to evacuate patients at those locations. Our footprint hasn't changed much in the last day. We still have 400 medical and public health responders deployed, and another 300 are on alert. They come from across the country and are part of the National Disaster Medical System and the U.S. Public Health Service. Again, as the administrator stated, in many places it's not safe to go back to your residence, and we want to emphasize that before you do that, you check with local health and emergency management authorities to ensure that the lifelines and the infrastructure is there to have a safe return. When you return, we'd like to see a safe return to those areas to make sure that you're not injured through the cleanup process. So that includes wearing boots, eye protection, gloves, and working with partners, so if you do get hurt, someone's able to contact emergency medical services. The bottom line is we want people to be safe and as healthy as possible after this storm, and we are doing everything we can to help in this response. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Doc. You know, our partners at the U.S. Coast Guard, as well as our National Guard partners and the heroes at the local level, first responders, have done a tremendous job of trying to do the life safety action and rescuing people, and we've been able to save several hundred lives or several hundred lives up to this point as courtesy of the United States Coast Guard. So, Captain, if you give us an update, please.
Good morning, everyone. So the main objectives for the Coast Guard operations remain safety of life, damage assessment, and the recovery of the maritime transportation system. So far, the Coast Guard has conducted 83 cases with 129 rescues and 1 animal rescue as well. There are 17 Coast Guard cutters, 9 fixed and 24 rotary wing aircraft, plus shallow water boat teams deployed in support of the post-storm search and rescue and damage assessment process. We also have numerous damage assessment teams and 2 reconstruction teams deployed. And these shallow water response teams have been conducting search and rescue efforts and removing debris from roadways to assist our local emergency responders to have access to roads. These teams help to assist 142 nursing home patients to transport them to safe haven at Pensacola Hospital. And Coast Guard port and environmental assessment teams are assessing damage caused by the hurricane and have been actively engaged with port partners to ensure impacted waterways are reopened when it's deemed safe to do so. Preliminary assessments indicate severe damage to Bay and Gulf counties in Florida, with numerous sunken vessels in those impacted areas. These vessels will be cataloged and monitored for environmental impact and removal. And we urge the public to not attempt to board a partially sunken vessel, as that is obviously dangerous. Please seek salvage assistance from a professional. As for port status, Pensacola and Cedar Key are now open, and Panama City remains closed, as do Wilmington and Morehead City, North Carolina, also still closed. And that's what I have today. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Captain. Next up, our partners at EPA, Mr. Reggie Cheatham.
Okay, thank you, Administrator Long. The Environmental Protection Agency, in coordination with the impacted states, is continuing to gather data on national priority list sites, as well as oil and chemical manufacturing sites, to assess and protect human health and environment. Yesterday, we had the good fortune to join the U.S. Coast Guard Gulf Strike Team and the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency in an aerial survey of the Florida coastal area from Pensacola to Apalachicola, Florida. The assessment focused on EPA and Florida DEP sites that are regulated by the 2 agencies. Currently, there are no reports of major releases of oil and hazardous substances. EPA is also providing support to the U.S. Corps of Engineers under ESF 3 for drinking water and wastewater assessments and assistance. In the 35 declared counties in Florida, we're currently seeing 205 systems operational, 3 partially operational, and are continuing to assess the status of 389 other sites. There are currently 8 active boil water advisories. At this time on the ground, in some areas, it remains dangerous and inaccessible. Once conditions allow, obviously our teams will be able to get into those areas and make the appropriate assessments. As always, the agency is prepared to support our state, federal, tribal, and local government officials as needed. That's our report today.
Thanks, Reggie. Next up, we have our partners with the Voluntary Organizations active in disasters that we depend on very heavily to help people. We have both the Red Cross here and the Salvation Army, and again, it's about neighbor helping neighbor. If you're looking to get involved, go to nvoad.org, nvoad.org, or redcross.org or salvationarmy.org. So with that, let's pull up Mr. Peter Macias from the American Red Cross in regards to sheltering.
Thank you, Administrator. The Red Cross continues to provide a safe place to stay for those thousands who've been impacted by the storm in evacuation centers and emergency shelters. We have about 1,000 trained disaster personnel on their way into the local area to support and augment the people who are already there. So we're excited about that. We understand that it's going to be a little challenge for the Red Cross to get supplies and personnel to some of the places because of the infrastructure. We'll continue working with our state, local, and federal partners to get there. To that end, I need to say thank you to the National Guards in the state of Florida, Alabama, and Georgia for their help yesterday in helping get Red Cross personnel and resources to where it was needed most. To those of you who are looking to reconnect with your families in impacted areas, may I suggest that you try the Red Cross Safe and Well website. Go to your web browser, type in Safe and Well, and it's a free reunification website that allows you to connect or leave a message for your loved ones. And if you have a smart device, you can register as well. All you have to do is text the word SAFE, S-A-F-E, and then the number 78876. Thanks, sir.
Right. Thank you. Next from the Salvation Army is Colonel Matthews. Thank you.
Good morning. Salvation Army continues to render assistance as it can. There have been several references to the infrastructure that's been damaged, and we are slowly following those who are clearing roads into areas with 48 mobile feeding kitchens. Each one of those is capable of 1,500 meals a day or more, and the aggregate total of 72,000 meals per day. We have not ceased to be involved in Puerto Rico or in the recovery after Florence at the same time. Lastly, we're working with 2 teams and 2 field kitchens capable of 30,000 meals a day with Operation Barbecue. Let me just say something about that. Those private partners who help assist those who have been harmed in this terrible storm get a little bit of home when they see the Operation Barbecue folks come in, and it's a part of that emotional revival that comes after the initial shock of what happened. So those of you who are reaching out to help those in your community, we thank you very much, and we'll be with you throughout the way.
All right. Thanks, Colonel. Next up, Army Corps of Engineers, Ray Alexander. Again, they're responsible for emergency power and infrastructure protection. So.
Thank you, Administrator Long. Good morning. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers remains fully engaged in supporting the federal response in support of FEMA, our federal agency partners, and the impacted states. Today, we have over 130 personnel deployed and supporting the mission from home station. Our South Atlantic Division remains responsible for our operations. Commanding General, Brigadier General Diana Holland, moved from Atlanta to Mobile, Alabama last night. She's on the ground today with the Mobile District Commander. They're going to attempt to do an overflight of the damaged area so they can continue the assessments. Likewise, our Jacksonville District Commander is also going to be out and doing circulation within the disaster area. We'll have senior leaders going forward this weekend. We also have liaison officers, subject matter experts, team leaders at all the state emergency operations centers and other key nodes. Today continues to be a day of assessments, movement of personnel and equipment, and water management where needed at reservoirs throughout the area. In terms of dam and levee safety, our initial assessment is most of our flood risk projects all escaped unharmed. We do have some hydropower dams with minor damage in Georgia, but not impacting operations. Significant rain in southwest Virginia last night elevated the Dan River. Those waters will make their way into our John H. Carr Reservoir, which has sufficient capacity to accommodate that. For temporary power, we have two power teams on the ground, one for Florida, one for Georgia, 4 on standby. They're moving today along with generators from bases at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama to Eglin Air Force Base in Albany, Georgia. For navigation, we're working with NOAA Coast Guard on surveys. Surveys began yesterday. They should be complete tomorrow. We're looking at the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway and Port St. Joe in Florida today. For debris, we continue mission scoping for route clearance and debris removal in Florida, and we've just begun to do the same for Georgia. No missions for roofing, water, wastewater. We're working with EPA. We'll continue planning for possible temporary roofing, infrastructure assessment, critical public facility support, bridge inspections, and coastal inspections as well. We are coordinating with all the military installations in the impacted area. We are prepared to provide our support in conducting assessments of any damage those installations have incurred. Lastly, we remain synchronized with the Department of Defense, Department of the Army response. Thanks, sir.
Okay. Thanks, Administrator. Muy buenos días, Daniel Yargués. Bueno, continuamos trabajando y haciendo todo lo posible para apoyar las tareas de respuesta en el estado de Florida, Alabama y Georgia, con nuestros socios federales, como pueden ver. Esta fue una tormenta histórica y bueno, continuamos trabajando muy arduamente. Hay mucho escombro en las calles, en las carreteras, mucho daño en las carreteras, también en los puentes. Le pedimos a las personas que por favor tengan mucha precaución, que no salgan y que no regresen a sus casas hasta que no sea indicado por las autoridades locales, ya que puede ser muy peligroso. Hay líneas eléctricas, cables caídos que pueden tener todavía energía, líneas de gas que están rotas también. Entonces, que sean pacientes y que tengan un poquito de paciencia. Sabemos que es difícil, pero puede ser muy peligroso dejar el refugio, el lugar donde están. Tenemos equipos de FEMA de asistencia. Estos equipos tienen un dispositivo para poder tomar las solicitudes de asistencia de FEMA. Vamos a estar yendo a los refugios primeramente para ofrecer este servicio. Si ve a un representante de FEMA en el refugio, puede solicitar asistencia. Se dio ayer, el presidente Trump otorgó la declaratoria presidencial para Florida, lo cual pues abre fondos federales, ofrece fondos federales a las personas que fueron afectadas. Continuamos haciendo y llevando a cabo evaluación de daños para agregar más condados a esa declaratoria presidencial. Hay dos formas para solicitar asistencia: el 1-800-621-3362, repito el número, 1-800-621-3362, la opción número 2 los lleva con un representante en español. También por medio de la aplicación de FEMA pueden someter su solicitud de asistencia por FEMA. Estamos también, hemos recibido alrededor de 4,000 solicitudes de asistencia hasta esta mañana. Estamos también apoyando las evacuaciones de los hospitales que fueron dañados a causa del huracán Michael. Como lo mencioné, continuamos haciendo evaluación de daños en conjunto con el Estado y con las autoridades locales. El administrador continúa platicando y llevando una constante comunicación con el gobernador de Florida. Va a estar allá este fin de semana para reunirse con él y ver cuáles son los daños. Como lo mencionó el administrador, son 7 los sectores que estamos enfocándonos. Es seguridad, agua, comida, refugios es el segundo, salud y servicios médicos es el tercero, el cuarto es la energía eléctrica y combustible, comunicaciones es muy importante ya que tenemos que mantener comunicación con las autoridades locales y también que los sobrevivientes puedan tener acceso a su teléfono celular, trabajando con el sector privado para poder restablecer esos servicios. Transportación es el sexto y los desechos peligrosos también estamos apoyando y es una de nuestras prioridades. También llevamos a cabo cientos de rescates en conjunto con la Guardia Costera y el mensaje para todos es: por favor, sean pacientes, no regresen a su casa si no es indicado por las autoridades locales, ya que puede ser muy peligroso. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. With that, our thoughts and prayers are with those who just went through one of the most devastating storms this country's seen since 1851. But rest assured that not only am I doing everything that I can, but the dedicated staff of FEMA and the coordinated federal response is doing everything that we can to alleviate pain and suffering as quickly as we can. But this is going to be a frustrating event. Category 4 storms bring the worst type of devastation that you've seen. We've seen the worst of the storm surge. We've seen the worst of the winds. And not only that, but it moved inland and it caused a lot of flash flooding problems and loss of life all the way through Virginia. It takes time to put these things back together and help communities strive for a new normal, but we are doing everything that we possibly can to move as quick as we can. So with that, we'll open it up for questions.
Clarity with ABC. Do you have an updated death toll? Can you describe any of these search and rescue? That you mentioned 130 rescue operations that have been underway. Can you describe them?
Yeah, so when it comes to a death toll, it's incredibly difficult, 24, 48 hours to get an accurate number. Unfortunately, I think you're going to see that number climb. I hope we don't see it climb dramatically, but I have, reasons to believe that, we still haven't gotten into some of the hardest hit areas, particularly the Mexico Beach area. And as I've been saying, anybody that, doesn't heed a warning to evacuate, particularly the coast, we ask them to do so because of the ocean rising and storm surge pushing buildings down. It's not the wind blowing them apart. It's the ocean and crashing waves going in. And very few people live to tell what it's like to experience storm surge. And unfortunately, in this country, we seem to not learn the lesson. In 1969, over 271 people were killed from Hurricane Camille, and it was because the ocean rose and basically swallowed them up. And then again, we learned it in Katrina. And while the world was focused on New Orleans, and rightfully so for the issues that were there, another 270 people lost their lives because the ocean rose 29 feet and had wave action on top of it. And the reason you don't hear about those 270 people is because they're not around to give an interview after the fact. And this is something I've been passionate about. It's something that the people inside FEMA are passionate about. It's why we cry for preparedness and help. We want people to understand how these storms attack communities. They're classified by winds, but storm surge causes the most amount of loss of life, and it causes the most amount of destruction, and you're witnessing it in Mexico Beach, and I hope that the country won't forget it. And that when you go back to rebuild these areas, that you do so in a resilient fashion, that we don't rebuild to the same standards, that we have locals and state governments start to implement real building codes across this country. It's frustrating to us because we repeat this cycle over and over again. Next question.
Fred Wallace from CNN. You've seen a lot of storms. What is really poignant to you? What is standing out to you in your mind about this one?
I can't get over the fact of the storm surge damage, and a lot of people here again. I go back to that because a lot of people think that a lot of those buildings in Mexico Beach were blown down, and they weren't. I constantly go through my mind on how do we actually build a true culture of preparedness in this country. I love the beach. I love the mountains. I grew up in the mountains in North Carolina. But if you want to live in these areas, you got to do it in a more resilient fashion. You got to mitigate your homes. You've got to understand why we ask you to evacuate. And every day we've got to figure out how to make this country more financially resilient. A lot of people can't put their hands on $500. Therefore, they're not properly insured. They're not spending the money to mitigate, or they're moving to areas where they've never experienced a Category 4 storm. And very few people have ever experienced a Cat 4, Cat 5 storm. I mean, we've only had 3 Cat 5s hit since 1851. Labor Day storm of 35, Andrew in 92, and Camille in 69. So, people often behave based on their past experience. But when these things happen, we learn, and what I'm afraid of is hurricane amnesia. 10 years is going to go by, and we're going to forget what happened in Mexico Beach. So how do we build a culture of preparedness? FEMA tries to do it every year, but a lot of people don't pay attention to anything that we do or say when it's a blue sky day and nothing's happening. People only focus the camera on us after big events like this. And that's the frustrating part of being FEMA administrator, or the people that dedicate their lives to trying to get people to understand these hazards. So you guys help me. How do we learn from this and move forward in a more resilient fashion and stop the vicious cycle of damage and destruction, time and time again? How do we rebuild this coastline or areas that are constantly devastated by flooding to a more resilient fashion? Now, something that was very transformational that occurred last week. Congress proactively approved the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. In that, it made pre-disaster mitigation a priority. 12 testimonies I've been crying for pre-disaster mitigation to be a priority. Congress did it, and I congratulate them. They made pre-disaster mitigation and resilience a priority that now, a certain percentage of the disaster dollars we spend in any given year to help communities recover will now be put up front in pre-disaster mitigation, real money up front to protect our infrastructure and to minimize loss of life, hopefully to minimize loss of life and the impact that disasters have to our infrastructure so that we stop this cycle. That's the only way we get through it. But building codes at the local and state level are the key to resiliency, not a bigger FEMA. We do everything that we can to work with our federal partners to save lives and stop damage and destruction. But we're just one part of the formula that's needed in the whole community to stop this madness. Next question.
What about federal flood standards? Would those help? I know
flood standards would help. A revised NFIP program would also help. We need the laws to change around the NFIP program. But we have to educate people on insurance. Insurance is the first line of defense, and it's not just flood insurance, it's fire insurance. And we see far too often where, people pay off their mortgage and then let their insurance lapse, and then their house burns down from California wildfires or whatever it may be. And insurance is the first line of defense, and we need insurance agents across this country and realtors to become part of our army to tell people how to properly mitigate a house, to properly mitigate, and insure their property and their businesses. And we scream for that because those who are insured from this event are going to recover a heck of a lot faster than those that aren't. FEMA's assistance is capped, and it's only going to kickstart recovery. It's never been designed to make anybody whole that just lost everything that they've ever worked for in their life and are uninsured. We're going to try to do everything that we can to kickstart hope and recovery, but we're not. But ours is a temporary patch. Insurance is the key. So how do we get people to understand earthquake insurance, fire insurance, flood insurance? We only map the special flood hazard area. We don't map all possibilities. If it rains in your community, your house can flood. But often people are talked out of flood insurance. Why? Next question.
You spoke of local potential mitigation efforts, but does the federal government have a role to play in addressing resiliency to storms or addressing climate change?
Yeah, we absolutely do. And I think, whether it's a changing climate, whether it's climate variability, thermohaline circulation, El Nino, whatever it is, whatever weather patterns are oscillating that increase and decrease activity, the bottom line is we try to push out and promote pre-disaster mitigation. And, it's part of the president's resiliency is part of the president's strategy, the pre-disaster mitigation piece, which Congress just did, but everybody's been asleep at the wheel on that bill. It's huge for us. It's absolutely huge for this country that the DRRA bill was passed. Because it made pre-disaster mitigation a priority. It could potentially put billions of dollars, into play every year on a pre-disaster cycle. And that's the type of stuff that never gets picked up about FEMA in the Blue Sky Day news or what Congress did. That's the frustrating part about the people that bust their rear ends inside this agency, never get a fair shake. They do promote it. They do push it, but it's like screaming in the wind. Nobody hears it. And here again, it's not a bigger FEMA that's going to solve the problems. Regardless of what's causing the issues, until we get building codes passed at local and state levels that are meaningful, then we're going to continue to see a lot of damage and destruction. And here again, I'm not telling people, where they should live and where they shouldn't. It's not up to me. But if they choose to live in different areas, there's a risk that comes with that. And they need to be properly insured, and they need to know how to mitigate their facilities. Next question. Let's keep going. This is great. You see this enough in your career, you get ticked off about it.
Going back to the rescue operations, are the majority of them, are you finding, you said you haven't even been to Mexico Beach yet, but are you just finding people wandering around, or are you finding people in flooded waters?
There's a small handful of people that apparently survived that are being interviewed, but we're not. There aren't people wandering around, seeking assistance. Right now, it's not that. This is not people waiting to be rescued. Unfortunately, what's happening is search and rescue trying to initially get into the to the rubble to make sure there's nobody covered up, nobody, or trying to assess if there's additional fatalities that are there. We're really concentrated on the people in shelters, right now, because anybody that evacuated Mexico Beach that's in a shelter, it's going to be a long time before they're actually able to go back and return to those areas because it was so heavily damaged. I'm anxious to get down there. I am, but right now my job, the best way I can serve the country is being here, making sure that the federal government from D.C. is doing everything that he can to get down. The president's anxious to get down. He'd have gone down 2 days ago if he could, but unfortunately he's in a tough spot. His presence could get in the way of the response because it takes a lot of assets to move the President of the United States around, and he's anxious to get down there too, and I know that we're working on that now to be able to do that, but I'm anxious to get down there and make sure that we're doing everything that we can. Yes, ma'am.
Would you say the issues and the difficulty in getting to some of those impacted areas is kind of a unique characteristic of this storm, or is that something that you see typically when a major storm hits?
It's typical with a storm like this. I mean, if you want to, here again, Katrina, the whole world was focused on New Orleans. But what's interesting, and if I remember correctly, with New Orleans, the wind speeds in New Orleans were about 85 miles an hour. Okay, even though it was a major hurricane, distance is everything, and where the eye makes landfall is everything. The maximum radius winds that define storms is typically just to the northeast of the eye, 10, 20, 30 miles out. So what you saw is the eye go right over Tyndall and pop Mexico Beach. And Mexico Beach saw the worst of the winds that classified the storm, and then it also, where the winds are the worst is where the storm surge in the ocean raises. And in that part of the Florida Panhandle, water is pumped in there and there's nowhere for it to go. It's hard to filter out east and west, and so it just comes up on shore and obliterates everything. So when it does that, you're pushing massive amounts of debris across roadways, and we saw that in Mississippi in Katrina, but nobody was focused on that. So go back and look at the damage that Katrina caused in Mississippi, and it's the same thing that you're seeing in Mexico Beach. But we weren't focused on that lesson. We were focused on other issues in New Orleans, and rightfully so. But we failed to learn the lesson of storm surge in Mississippi that was just learned again. So how do we make sure in 10 years from now that we're not doing this again and again? And when we ask people at the local and state level to heed the warnings, dang it, do it. Get out.
We have time for one more question.
All right.
And I guess my other question is just seeing the damage like 50 miles or so inland, were those people accurately alerted and
Yeah, they were. I mean, I stood here before you guys the other day and told the citizens of Georgia, you better stand up and be ready for this. I mean, it was, you need to be on alert. It's coming. And guys, I grew up in North Carolina, 5 hours inland. Hurricane Hugo came 5 hours inland over my house in 1989 and was still a Cat 1 storm with 110 mile an hour gusts, 5 hours inland. Over 20 trees down in my yard, power out for 2 weeks. I carry that experience with me every day. And, hurricanes are not just coastal events. We saw it with Florence. Look at the flooding that came in. And each one attacks us differently. You get storms that travel up the East Coast like Florence. They're not getting better organized. They're falling apart and they're expanding, which means more rainfall, more devastation inland, pumping water in those back bay and inlet areas and flooding the West Pamlico Sounds and not necessarily the beach with storm surge. Each one of these things is different. Andrew was a tightly wound Cat 5 where the maximum radius winds, and the hurricane winds extension was very small, and we were fortunate by that. But those that experienced the maximum radius winds saw the worst. But that storm hit in an area on the East Coast where the continental shelf is steep, so storm surge wasn't bad. It was all about the wind, and it was all about a lack of a building code at the time, and you saw the devastation. So each one of these is different, and that's why we ask you to evacuate. It's hard to pinpoint how each one of these storms is going to attack. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. All right.